So Saints John Fisher and Thomas More. John Fisher, a bishop, and Thomas More, Chancellor of England, one of the closest political workers with the monarch, King Henry VIII. And they are held up to us as men of, above all, perhaps of fidelity. For these two men, the idea of, if they were to hear the word martyr, martyrs, people who had been put to death for their faith, for them they would have immediately thought back to the early Christians, those in the early church who were put to death by the Roman emperors for their Christianity. And so martyrdom for them was something that was kind of part of the history of the church, something in the early days, because by this time, of course, the whole of Europe was Christian, and there were missions to the rest of the world, and Christianity was very stable. There was very little danger of martyrdom for most Christians in the various situations in which they found themselves. And so it would have been almost totally unbelievable for them to think that martyrdom and a new series of martyrs in the life of the church could be just round the corner in their own time and indeed in their own nation. Because these two men, of course, lived at the time when Europe was about to be pulled apart by both the errors of Protestantism and by the attempts by civil authorities to gain power over things that were of divine law, and these two men remained faithful. John Fisher was the only bishop to stay faithful to the church. He, in his fidelity, didn't condemn his brother bishops. He didn't really do anything kind of outward in order to try and bring them back to the truth. He just stated that he had to follow his conscience, and for him that conscience meant that he couldn't accept the attempt by King Henry VIII to divorce Queen Catherine and to therefore start on his run of wives that he went through. And for Thomas More, similarly, he too, as Chancellor, couldn't accept the change in the law to make King Henry head of the church in this land. This seemingly quite simple issue of Henry's marriage led, of course, to many more martyrs than just these two men. And even here in the village of Walsingham, we experienced both those who did side with Henry, who left communion with the Church of Rome in order to stay faithful to the king. We can't look into what their motives were, but they saved their heads. But also, the village of Walsingham witnessed people who could not, in their conscience, give in to the will of the king and the authorities, and were martyred here in this very place. We're fortunate that yesterday we had the Queen's speech, and the Chancellor, as the Chancellor has done for a long time, carried in the procession the will of the Queen, what the speech that she was going to read out to say what she wanted her Parliament to work through over the next term of government. And Thomas More would have done just that in his own time as Chancellor of England. He too was bound up in the life of parliamentary decision making. But the thing that Thomas More teaches us is that along with his attempting to serve faithfully the authorities of the land and to do and carry out his duties as best as he possibly could, he knew that the will that he followed above all else was the will of God, and that eventually that would mean him having to leave his position in order that he could be faithful to his conscience and to the integrity that he tried to practice. Now, probably we won't have to face such matters in our own lifetime. Perhaps some of us may. But what Thomas More and John Fisher teach each of us is this lesson of faithfulness in the face of those who do not share our positions on morals or on matters of faith. And this might be people in authority over us, governments, people who make legislation about education or about the teachings on marriage and family life, teachings about the protection of life in general, whatever it might be. Sometimes things become law that don't fit in with the truths of the gospel. And Thomas More teaches us that sometimes we have to not go along with these things. Sometimes we have to be able to not necessarily speak out against them if we're not in a position to do so, but always in our own heart remain faithful to the truth and not go along with changing ideas in society about matters which are in fact matters that God has established. Perhaps more closer to home, though, I'd hazard a guess that many of us come across people who disagree with some of the things that we believe amongst our own families, and if not our families, then perhaps our acquaintances, friends, people that we work with. And we have that challenge that we must be people always of peace and communion, that we must always strive to live together in harmony, but also that we must never give in to our views and the things that we have learnt from Christ and that have been handed down to us through the life of the church. We must never give in to them, even though it might sometimes make situations a little uncomfortable. So we ask the prayers of these two men, perhaps especially in our own time, as the political life in our country takes interesting turns even day by day at the moment. We ask that those in authority might always strive to be faithful to gospel values, that they might be faithful to true liberalism, in the sense of everyone being able to have the right to practice their faith and believe what their faith teaches, and not be forced to give in to the teachings of the law, as we heard about in the first reading, with Eleazar refusing to give in to the worship of the pagan gods. We ask that these two men may help each of us individually to stay faithful, not out of any sense of being faithful through gritted teeth, but faithful because we know that what we have received is in fact the way to true happiness, the way to the fullness of life, the way to true human fulfillment that God has mapped out for us.